On the last episode of the podcast, Joseph Smith arrived in Carthage, Illinois at night. He was escorted there by Governor Ford's posse, and Joseph was met outside his hotel by the angry Carthage Greys, Carthage's local militia. In an effort to calm them down, Governor Ford, who was also staying at the same hotel, told the men that they would officially be introduced to Joseph Smith in the morning. I'm Stephen Detloff, and this is the Strangers and Pilgrims podcast, telling the story of the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. In the morning, as promised, Governor Ford lines up the Carthage militia to be introduced to Joseph. And he walks Joseph and Hiram down military lines. John Taylor and other non-Nauvoo Legion leaders follow behind them. It's a very formal event, kind of like just a formal introduction by the governor of one military leader to the other state militias. However, the Carthage militia are not allowing themselves to be introduced to Joseph and Hiram officially. Instead, they're screaming and shouting like they were the night before. And one of the men, after being introduced to General Joseph Smith, shouts, quote, "I will introduce myself in a different style," end quote. And he throws off his hat and pulls out his sword and sticks it right in Joseph's face. The other men are shouting, "No introduction for us, down with all imposters." The governor is probably becoming frustrated at this point. He has come all the way out to Carthage to try and broker peace between the two feuding sides, but he's finding it difficult. He tells the Carthage Greys, which again is the name of the local Carthage militia, quote, "Would you please not act so rudely? Please, look at him. Is there anything in this man's appearance that leads you to believe him a desperate character?" End quote. And one of the men responds, he says, "No, sir," and then turning to Joseph says, quote, "But we cannot see what is in your heart, neither can we tell your intentions," end quote. And Joseph then responds, he says, quote, "Very true, gentlemen, you cannot see into my heart, but I can see into yours, and I can see that you thirst for my blood, and nothing but my blood will satisfy you," end quote. If the governor was frustrated with the local militia's reaction to Joseph, Joseph's reaction to them also probably frustrated him. He did not have control over either side of this conflict. Later, commenting on this moment that Governor Ford introduced Joseph to the local militia, one of the militia leaders said that Governor Ford, quote, "had no more command over his men than he would have had over a pack of wild Indians," end quote. And so what the governor had started to fear, what he had wrote about in his letter to Joseph, urging him to come to Carthage, was already happening. The militia was beginning to be, quote, "beyond legal control," end quote. And in fact, we saw in the last episode when the governor sent men out to Warsaw to confiscate the weapons of the Warsaw militia and disband them, that some of the men there refused the orders and they kept their weapons. So the citizens of Hancock County have already started to ignore their government. Meanwhile, the Latter-day Saints are relying on their government for safety. Joseph Smith's day in court in Carthage is very short. The prosecution ends up requesting an adjournment. They tell the judge they need more time to collect their witnesses in the case against Joseph Smith for the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor. Even though William Law and Francis Higbee and all their business partners are already in town, there are apparently some other important witnesses who are not there yet. And it's a Tuesday, so the judge gives the prosecution until the upcoming Saturday to get all their witnesses together. And in the meantime, Joseph Smith and the other defendants will be forced to stay in jail or pay $500 per person bail. This is a lot of money, but Joseph and his friends do not want to stay in jail overnight out of fear of their life. So Joseph's bodyguard, Stephen Markham, that day sells his house in Nauvoo. He sells his house and puts up the money for Joseph Smith to pay for bail, so that Joseph can leave the city and return to the safety of Nauvoo. And when Stephen eventually returns to Nauvoo, he will move his family out of their house and into a tent. This is how much Stephen Markham loved the prophet Joseph Smith. And this is an amazing moment to me and an important contrast between the men and women that left Joseph Smith and left the church and began to attack him, and those that stayed loyal and faithful to him. Joseph had a lot of enemies, but he also had a lot of friends. Back at the Hamilton house, Joseph is saying goodbye to some of the men who traveled out to Carthage with him from Nauvoo. Joseph is looking to get a meeting with Governor Ford before he and Hiram head back to Nauvoo as well. While they're standing in the hotel, the constable, who issued their first arrest warrant for the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor 2 weeks earlier, appears. He has another arrest warrant, and Hiram and Joseph tell him that they're not going to jail because they just got out on bail. The constable tells them no, this is for a new charge, a charge of treason. And this charge will be different than the charge for inciting a riot. and destroying the Nauvoo expositor, because there's no bail for treason without appearing before a circuit judge, and the closest circuit judge was a full day's horse ride away from Carthage. So at the very least, Joseph and Hiram will have to stay in jail in Carthage for 2 more days. John Taylor, who's standing nearby, hears this, and he runs upstairs to Governor Ford's room in the hotel. And he tells the governor that Joseph is being charged with treason and that he's going to jail. The governor acts unsurprised. He tells John that he cannot do anything to help Joseph, as that is in the judicial branch of the government, and he is only in the executive. He cannot interfere with the judiciary. And Governor Ford, in the history of Illinois that he would write, suggested that Joseph Smith was put in jail for treason because he declared martial law in Nauvoo, and that martial law would be treasonous in the scenario where it prevented a posse from the county sheriff entering Nauvoo and arresting Joseph. However, that was a hypothetical situation which never happened, and the governor acknowledges that the charge of treason would never actually stick, unless they could have found an instance after the fact where an arresting party was prevented from entering the city to carry out a warrant. But this charge of treason was never intended to actually stick. It looks like the charge of treason was a backup plan to make sure Joseph stayed in Carthage after he got there, because after Joseph was released on bail for the charge of causing a riot, 2 men went to the judge and both filed treason charges to ensure that Joseph stayed in town that night. Well, at this point, a large mob of angry men has collected outside the Hamilton Hotel, and the time that Joseph left court for the charges of destroying the Nauvoo Expositor Press, got to the hotel and was getting ready to speak with Governor Ford, a mob has got up. And in the middle of that mob is the constable with this new arrest warrant and his posse. So now Joseph must travel from the Hamilton Hotel to Carthage jail. And so Joseph and Hiram are pushed through the angry mob to go to jail, and some of the men in the arresting party form a protective circle around Joseph, and Joseph's friends who are still in Carthage form another circle around him to push back the mob as they walk through the city streets. Joseph Smith's bodyguard, Stephen Markham, and another loyal friend to Joseph named Dan Jones kind of float in the bubble made between these 2 protective circles of men, and Stephen has his knotted hickory cane that he called the rascal beater, and as the mob pushes up against the men, forming these rings of protection, they poke through their bayonets to try and stab Joseph, and they rush to get at him. Occasionally, a few of these men will break through that first line of defense, and Stephen Markham will beat them with his cane. And on the other side of the circle, Dan Jones also fights off the men that break through. He beats them away with his own cane. Stephen Markham's cane, by the way, is also in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Church History Museum in Salt Lake City, along with some of the other items that we've talked about in this story and will talk about. And if you ever make it out there and are interested in seeing some of the items involved in the story, I think you should. And so the men make it to Carthage jail, and only Joseph and Hiram are arrested for treason, but there are about 10 of the men in jail there total. Well, these are friends of the prophet who followed him out from Nauvoo and are not going to leave his side, and they've been allowed to stay in the jail with the prophet. And the Carthage jail is 2 stories. The bottom floor is the house of the jailer and his family, and the upper floor is where prisoners are held. Now, the prisoners first get put in the jail cell, but the jailer comes up and sees the 2 prisoners and the 8 other men who have joined them in there, and he tells them that there isn't any place for them. So he puts them in the debtor's room, which is back downstairs. It has no furniture or anything, it's just a bare room. And all night, men with guns regularly come up and look through the window at the prisoners and their friends who sleep on the floor, using their boots and arms as pillows. And Joseph and Hiram end up pushing themselves up against the wall right below the window to protect themselves from anyone that might decide to shoot through the window while they're asleep. The next morning, Joseph wakes up and has a meeting with the jailer. The jailer feeds him a nice breakfast, and the jailer is actually sympathetic to Joseph and the Latter-day Saints. His housekeeper is a Latter-day Saint. His housekeeper is the little sister of one of the church leaders and a convert that had immigrated to Illinois from England. So he has a little different perspective on who the Latter-day Saints are, as he knows them, and what they're about, having lived with one for so long. Well, Joseph and his friends are then moved from the debtor's room downstairs to the sitting room upstairs. This is a nice room adjacent to the jail cell that they were briefly in the night before. It had a small bed and a desk and a fireplace, and it's right at the top of the stairs. Later in the day, Governor Ford comes to visit with Joseph and Hiram. Now, I'll quote some of the conversation here, but this conversation wasn't written until 3 years after it took place, and it was written by John Taylor, who was in the room at the time. So I'm quoting what John Taylor remembers Governor Ford and Joseph Smith saying to each other. The conversation starts out with Governor Ford telling Joseph Smith that he should not have destroyed the Nauvoo expositor, and that it makes Joseph look like he is, quote, turbulent and defiant of the laws and institutions of the country, end quote. And the governor tells him that the instance of destroying the press is, quote, the principal cause of this difficulty, end quote. And Joseph acknowledges that men, quote, may differ somewhat in their opinions, end quote, about the legality of this destruction of the Nauvoo expositor. And he then goes on to explain again to the governor their reasoning and their belief that their actions were legal. And he again reminds the governor that he and his people have been persecuted and endured, quote, every conceivable indignity and lawless outrage perpetrated since our settlement here, end quote. Joseph also turns the conversation to why they're actually in jail, the charge of treason, which is predicated on Joseph declaring martial law. And Joseph says, quote, who ordered out the Nauvoo Legion? I did, under your direction. For what purpose? To suppress insurrectionary movements, end quote. He tries to explain to the governor that what he did was completely legal. The governor, however, still disagrees with Joseph's use of martial law, which again, years later in his history, the governor would say would have been treasonous only had it inhibited a posse issuing an arrest warrant, and which again was only hypothetical. Their conversation then shifts, and the governor talks to Joseph about wanting to go to speak in Nauvoo the following day to the Latter-day Saints living there. He's not sure if he'll go yet, but he's thinking about it. And Joseph asks the governor if he could go with him back to Nauvoo to help ease the minds of his people. But the governor tells Joseph Smith that that won't be necessary, and that if he goes, he'll go by himself. And the conversation is essentially the same disagreements that they've been having for the last month. I think to the governor, he probably ends up leaving with maybe a little bit of discouragement, seeing the conversation just going in circles, the conversation that they've been having through letters for the last month. So on his way out of the jail, when they've gotten outside and the door's been closed, the governor turns to one of the colonels of the militia, who had gone upstairs to visit Joseph Smith with him, and says, quote, oh, it is all nonsense. You will have to drive these Mormons out yet, end quote. And it looks to me here like the governor is finally broke. He had originally come to Carthage to try and broker peace between the Latter-day Saints and their enemies. He has come to decide, however, that the only solution he can see to prevent a war is to allow one side to drive the other side out of the state, prevent a war by causing an exodus. Well, that evening at the Hamilton Hotel, there's a meeting regarding Joseph Smith, and in that meeting, men decide that they'll kill the prophet on the following day. And at the same time, in Warsaw, another meeting of men determined the same thing. They propose that on the following day, 20 men will go to Carthage to kill the prophet. Well, later in the night, one of the members of the mob, a newspaperman, sends a letter to his paper for publication. And in his letter, he writes, quote, you need not be at all surprised to hear at any time of the destruction of the two Smiths by the populace. The governor has placed a guard of 50 men to protect the jail in which they are confined from attack and destruction, but judging from what I hear and see, I entertain but little hope of success of this effort. End quote. Now, this guard of 50 men who were placed to protect the prophet Joseph Smith from the mobs, they're the same men who met Joseph outside the Hamilton house when he arrives in Carthage a few days earlier. They're the men threatening his life and screaming and throwing their weapons. They're the Carthage Greys. So the next morning is June 27th, and it's the morning of the day that Joseph Smith will be murdered. And Thomas Sharp, not in Carthage, but still back in Warsaw, goes down to the railroad shanties that have been built outside the city to house the men working on the railroads. And Thomas Sharp shouts to the men in the shanties, quote, the time has come to do something to stop the Mormon prophet. Who will come to help us? End quote. And the men are worried. They're uncertain. They know that the governor had a militia, the Carthage Greys, guarding Joseph Smith in jail. They probably, however, don't know how much the Carthage Greys hate the prophet. And they probably don't know that just a day earlier, one of their commanders felt that Governor Ford had, quote, no more command over his men than he would have had over a pack of wild Indians, end quote. But Thomas and the men in Warsaw are not going to let any perceived obstacles stop them anymore. Thomas is tired of Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints. He doesn't have the patience for them or the governor. And Thomas says, quote, if the governor tries to stop me, I'll take his head from off his shoulders, end quote. And he then tells the men at the shanties that they need to go right now, this instant, to murder the two brothers. He says, quote, we must hasten to Carthage and murder the Smiths while the governor is absent at Nauvoo. The news of Joseph's death will so enrage the Mormons that they will fall upon and murder Tom Ford, and we shall be rid of the damned little governor and the Mormons too." End quote. Thomas Sharp has been trying now to kill Joseph for years, and the governor has been nothing but a hindrance to him, or at the very least not helpful, insisting that the laws be kept, insisting that due process be followed, insisting that the Latter-day Saints be given an opportunity. Now again, Thomas Sharp doesn't know that the winds have started to shift in Carthage. He doesn't know that yesterday, upon leaving the jail, the governor remarked, quote, "Oh, it's all nonsense. You will have to drive these Mormons out yet," end quote. So as the governor begins to kowtow to some of these populist rages in Hancock County, Thomas Sharp, hoping to kill two birds with one stone, hoping to kill Joseph Smith and then have the Latter-day Saints kill the governor, marches off to Carthage with a small group of people to assassinate the prophet. And as Thomas Sharp marches to Carthage, one of the men in jail with Joseph, Dan Jones, goes downstairs to ask one of the guards outside about some shots they had heard fired in the middle of the night. The captain of the guards tells him, quote, "You know, we've had too much trouble bringing Joe Smith here to ever let him escape alive. Unless you want to die with him, you'd better leave before sundown," end quote. Now Dan, scared for the prophet's life at what he's just been told, runs to town to tell the governor. And there had started to be a lot of talk in town. Just the night before at the Hamilton Hotel, Dan heard two of the leaders of the mob talking about murdering Joseph Smith. And they had said almost the exact same thing as the captain of the guards downstairs. They had said it had been too much work to get Joseph to Carthage, and that they couldn't let him make it back to Nauvoo alive. And one of them actually pulled out his pistol and said, quote, "The balls are in there that will decide his case," end quote. So Dan runs to town and tells the governor about this new threat, now coming from the captain of the guards that are watching Joseph. And the governor tells him that he is being, quote, "unnecessarily alarmed for the safety of his friends," end quote. The governor tells Dan that the people are not that cruel and that they are not going to try and kill Joseph. Dan goes back to jail and tells Joseph what has happened. And Joseph gives Dan a letter to give his wife. And in the letter he says, quote, "Dear Emma, I am very much resigned to my lot, knowing I am justified and have done the best that could be done. Give my love to the children and all my friends," end quote. It's interesting that Dan was asked to carry this letter from the prophet to his wife. Dan, who was 34 years old at the time, had actually only been a member of the Restored Church of Jesus Christ for a little over a year. And Dan was a steamboat captain who had first learned about the church through Thomas Sharp's anti-Mormon paper, the Warsaw Signal. And just from reading the Warsaw Signal, Dan had decided that Thomas Sharp's claims against the Latter-day Saints could not be true because of how contradictory they were to one another and how overzealous they were. But even though he didn't believe what was coming out of the Warsaw Signal, Dan had not gotten an interest in the church's truth claims until somehow he found part of a letter that Joseph had given to Emma when he was in Liberty Jail back in Missouri. Somehow this letter that Emma was supposed to deliver to another woman in the church had found its way to Dan on his steamboat, and Dan was impressed with the writing. He was impressed with its religious teachings and its attitude towards persecution. The letter encouraged this woman to, quote, "rejoice in the midst of her tribulations at being worthy to suffer all that for a testimony of Jesus and the gospel," end quote. Dan was so impressed with Joseph's letter that it led him to investigate the church, and he was soon baptized. 3 months after getting baptized, Dan met the prophet, and they became fast friends. And so now the prophet, once again in jail, once again experiencing persecution, was sending out a letter of consolation, and this time Dan was the messenger. And while Joseph has been in Nauvoo, Emma was doing writing of her own. Remember, when Joseph was in Nauvoo, helping the Nauvoo Legion turn in their muskets to the state government, Joseph had snuck back home 3 times to try and get Emma to go to Carthage with him. And she had told Joseph she couldn't go, and then she asked Joseph for a blessing, and Joseph told her that he didn't have time, but he had her write it out, and he told her he'd sign it once he got back. Well, Emma, with her own pen and paper, had wrote out that blessings as, quote, "these desires of my heart," end quote. I won't read to you the whole thing, but I'll read to you 3 sections. Emma starts the blessing with, quote, "First of all, that I would crave as the richest of heaven's blessings would be wisdom from my heavenly Father bestowed daily, so that whatever I might do or say, I could not look back at the close of day with regret," end quote. And in the middle of the letter, she says, quote, "I particularly desire wisdom to bring up all the children that are or may be committed to my charge in such a manner that they will be useful ornaments in the kingdom of God, and in a coming day arise up and call me blessed." End quote. Emma closes her blessing with, quote, "I desire that whatever may be my lot through life, I may be enabled to acknowledge the hand of God in all things." End quote. So Dan Jones goes back to Nauvoo with this letter for Emma, a letter which says the prophet is resigned to his lot and has done the best he could. And the other of Joseph's guests in jail, as they come and go from jail throughout the day, are driven off by mobs and chased and attacked. Others, when they leave, are simply not allowed back inside the jail. So by the time evening rolls around, of the 8 people that were in the jail, along with Joseph and Hiram, and of the numerous guests who had come in and out of the jail during the day, the 2 brothers are only joined by 2 others, John Taylor and Willard Richards, the two 12 apostles who stayed back in Nauvoo and didn't go out to electioneer for Joseph's presidential campaign. Well, as news and rumors continue to grow outside concerning an imminent attack on the mob, the jailer comes upstairs and tells Joseph there could be trouble later in the day. He tells Joseph and his friends, that he and his friends better leave the sitting room and lock themselves in the jail cell where they'll be safer. Joseph tells the jailer thank you and that they will probably go into the jail cell in the evening after dinner. As the jailer leaves, Joseph is standing there in the hallway looking into the jail cell with Willard, and he asks him, quote, "If we go into the cell, will you go in with us?" End quote. Because remember, it's still only Joseph and Hiram who technically are arrested and have to go in there. In response, Willard says to Joseph, quote, "Brother Joseph, you did not ask me to cross the river with you." That's the Mississippi River into Iowa. Willard says, quote, "Brother Joseph, you did not ask me to cross the river with you. You did not ask me to come to Carthage. You did not ask me to come to jail with you. And do you think I would forsake you now? But I will tell you what I will do. If you are condemned to be hung for treason, I will be hung in your stead, and you shall go free." End quote. And Joseph said, "You cannot," but Willard replied, "I will." And this moment reminds me of the great sacrifice that Stephen Markham made of selling his house to pay the prophet's bail. Willard tells the prophet that he would die for him. And again, even now, even though the last 14 years of his life, Joseph has been betrayed and left by countless numbers of friends and associates, he still had men and women who loved him and cared for him and would give everything they could for him. Now, back in Missouri, when Joseph was in Liberty Jail for treason and was feeling low and down, the Latter-day Saints were being driven across the winter countryside as refugees, and all their property had been stolen and their land had been taken. As Joseph was sitting in jail with the other 5 leaders of the church and leaders of the local militia, Joseph felt the Lord tell him, quote, "Thy friends do stand by thee, and they shall hail thee again with warm hearts and friendly hands. Thou art not yet as Job. Thy friends do not contend against thee, neither charge thee with transgression as they did Job." End quote. And Joseph, who had lost a lot of friends, still had a lot of friends who fought for and loved him. Well, with all these people coming in and out of the jail to talk with Joseph and help him, throughout the day, one of Joseph's visitors, a man named Cyrus Wheelock, had snuck him in 2 pistols. One was a little pepperbox pistol, and the other was a single-barrel pistol. Well, as the rumors get more intense and the threat of violence grows, Joseph approaches Hiram and gives him the single barrel. And Hiram looks at the gun and is kind of put off. He says, quote, "I hate to use such things or see them used," end quote. And Joseph agrees, but then tells Hiram that they may have to use them. So Hiram puts the gun in his coat pocket, and Joseph hides his small pistol in the desk there in the room. Now, while Joseph and Hiram feel their enemies closing in on them, Governor Ford has traveled to Nauvoo, and Emma has made breakfast and then lunch for Governor Ford and 40 of his fellow travelers from Carthage. And Governor Ford and the men traveling with him are using Joseph's upstairs office in his house as their own while they're in town. And after this, Governor Ford addresses the men and women of Nauvoo. He gives a speech to the citizens there, and he's speaking to them from the parade grounds, right across from Joseph's house, delivering his speech on top of the same building or timber framework that Joseph delivered his speech when he declared martial law. Governor Ford tells the people gathered, quote, "You must understand the amount of hatred and prejudice which prevails against you everywhere. Your neighbors believe you are going to overthrow the entire establishment of our country," end quote. Governor Ford blames the Latter-day Saints there for their own persecution and tells them that they must change their behavior and change their attitudes in order to stop the persecution against them. Meanwhile, back in Carthage, a mob of men have assembled in the woods. They're frustrated with the government's slow response to Joseph, and they want to kill him now. This group of men paint their faces with black gunpowder to hide their identities, and they start marching through the woods towards Carthage jail. The mob is composed of the three main groups of enemies of Joseph. They have all, over the last few weeks and months, met up and become acquainted with one another and organized their efforts to a degree. The first group of men in this mob is the former Latter-day Saints, who are now excommunicated. They're led by William Law. The second group is the natives of Illinois, led by the spokesman for the anti-Mormon party, Thomas Sharp. And the third group of men are those who are concerned with Joseph and his political aspirations, of his trying to establish the kingdom of Daniel that we talked about. Now, even though William Law was the leader of the excommunicated Latter-day Saints, he was not there in the mob. William had actually left Carthage earlier that morning to go to Iowa to meet with Secretary of State Calhoun's sons, the same sons that Joseph met with the night he briefly escaped into Iowa. And it's my opinion that William Law left to meet with them because he was scared that Joseph Smith had told them something negative about himself in the meeting, and William wanted to do damage control. One night earlier in the year, a few men from Missouri had crossed over the Mississippi River into Nauvoo with weapons, and they were there to assassinate Joseph, when they could have hated the prophet or they could have just been bounty hunters, but at the time, because at the time there was a bounty out for Joseph's head. The story is that the assassins ended up finding William Law in Nauvoo, who snuck them in over to Joseph's house in the middle of the night. Pretending that he was still a friend of the prophet, William tried to get Joseph Smith to come outside so that these men could kill him. But Joseph, seeing the two men and being protected by his bodyguards outside the gate to his house, wouldn't leave his house. So this half-hearted assassination attempt failed. But everyone in Nauvoo knew what William had done, that he had led these Missouri assassins to Joseph's house in the middle of the night. And William Law, after the fact, realized how bad this made him look, and he wrote a big apology letter that was published. And he said that he was sorry for the way he had acted in directing murderers to Joseph's home in the middle of the night, and that he would kind of shape up and act better. So I think in the last few months of Joseph's life, William was in this weird balancing act of trying to direct his secret organization to destroy Joseph Smith, all the while keeping up the image of this prophet of a new Reformation religion and being an upstanding citizen and an upstanding businessman. And other writers and historians have written suggesting that William's meeting with the Calhoun's son is proof of some sort of national conspiracy to kill the prophet of which the Secretary of State was a part, but I don't personally believe that necessarily. And one of the reasons I don't believe that is when William left earlier in the morning, his friends and business partners were upset with him. They wanted him to stay. They wanted him to finish off the job. When William left Carthage, he said that because Joseph was in jail, they couldn't do anything to get him anyway, so he might as well go to Iowa and come back Saturday for the trial. His friends, though, were insistent. They told him that they would do what the law could not do. But William left, and his friends and allies remained. Back to the mob of men in the forest, with their faces painted black with gunpowder. As the mob gets closer to the jail, they split into two groups. At the front of one of these groups is Charles Foster. He's an excommunicated Latter-day Saint, a member of William's new religion and the secret society. One of the owners of the Nauvoo Expositor, and he's leading the march up to the door of the jail. The second mob group is marching up to the window of the sitting room where Joseph Smith is staying. They're marching up towards the second-story window, and directly outside the window, below it on the ground, is a water well. At the front of this group is Thomas Sharp and his group of militiamen from Warsaw. So again, you see, each of these groups of men who are trying to kill the prophet have joined together, and they're marching on Carthage jail. When upstairs, inside the room, John Taylor and Willard Richards are looking out the window for trouble, and they see the men marching out the window, coming up towards the well. And John Taylor shouts, quote, "They are coming," end quote. And the men all run to get weapons to defend themselves with. Hiram and Joseph get their guns, and John Taylor grabs Stephen Markham's rascal-beating cane and gives Willard Richards his own cane. And gunshots are heard below. There's 4 shots, and they are from the guards' guns who were protecting Joseph Smith inside the jail from the mob. The guns, however, were filled with blank rounds. The attempt at stopping the mob from storming the jail was only for show. And at the sound of gunfire, Willard and Hiram run up to the door of the sitting room and slam it shut. They brace it with their shoulders, and the door thuds as men from the other side attempt to open it. And a bullet flies through the closed door, and scared, Willard and Hiram step back from where they were bracing the door and step back towards the far wall. Hiram is fumbling with his pistol when the door swings open, and Hiram is shot in the face. He says, quote, "I am a dead man," end quote. Another bullet shatters the window behind him and hits him in the back, and Hiram falls to the floor. The door to the small room is now open, and muskets and bayonets poke through the entry. None of the mob, however, is entering the room. They all simply stop at the open doorway, fire, and retreat to allow other men to come up and fill their place. As the ceiling becomes pockmarked with holes from the musket balls, Joseph, on his hands and knees, crawls over to his brother. He kneels above him and cries, quote, "Oh, my poor, dear brother Hiram," end quote. With bullets coming in through the window and bullets coming in through the door, but no one actually entering the room, Joseph, Willard, and John all run to the wall right next to the door. Joseph Smith pulls out his pistol and pulls the trigger 6 times through the door. 3 of the shots misfire, and 3 of the shots go into the crowd. John Taylor, with Stephen Markham's cane, is knocking the muskets away as they poke in through the door, causing more bullets to get fired into the ceiling. And Joseph tells him, quote, "That's right, Brother Taylor, parry them off as best you can," end quote. John Taylor, with his back against the wall right next to the door, looks across the room at the open window. He looks at the window as his only way to get out alive, and so he makes a run for it, all the way across the room. As he reaches the window, he is hit by a bullet in the leg. He falls forward and slams into the window, and the force of the fall stops his pocket watch, preserving the exact time of the mob's attack. He crumples to the ground and sees the small twin bed in the room. He rolls underneath it, where he is shot 3 more times, and one of the bullets rips a chunk of flesh out of his leg the size of a hand. Joseph looks at John Taylor getting shot, and he looks at Willard, who has now shifted over and is hitting away muskets that poke through the door with his cane. Joseph decides that he must run for the window too. He drops his gun and marches to the window. He sticks his leg out as if to jump and shouts, quote, "O Lord, my God," end quote. But immediately Joseph is hit by 2 bullets in the back. As he falls out of the 2nd-story window, he is hit in the air by another bullet in the chest. He lands on the ground. Slowly, he picks himself up and crawls over to the nearby well. Using his last bit of strength, he sits up against the well, stretches out one of his legs, and brings the other up towards him. He closes his eyes and dies. And Willard runs over to the window to see Joseph laying up outside against the well. He gets down on the floor and drags John Taylor out from underneath the bed, and he tells John that they have killed Joseph. On the next episode of the podcast, Joseph and Hiram are brought back to Nauvoo. Scripts of each podcast episode can be found at our website, www.pilgrimspodcast.com. Music for this episode is from the song Carthage Waltz. It was written and recorded by Michael Hinckley, and the dialogue was written and recorded by myself, Stephen Detloff.